I now present to you my favorite headline of all time. This is from The Atlantic. It says, Americans are pretty skeptical that hard work will pay off. Moving up the economic ladder relies on more than self-motivation. It also requires opportunity. Yeah, I believe this is part of a study in the Journal of Duh. How is this? How did somebody write that headline? Like, I gotta let people know this is like a public service, you know. Americans think, hey, maybe if you just bust your ass all the time, that it doesn't always necessarily work out. Yeah, no shit. No shit. Like what? People were still under the child's assumption of like, everything is a meritocracy. The harder you work, the further you go. Guys, I know people, I'm sure you know people, who are some of the hardest workers you've ever seen in your life. They work 2 jobs, they work 3 jobs, they don't have a second to breathe or for themselves, and they make next to nothing. And then you know other people who spoiled, pampered little prick brats who were born with a silver spoon in their mouth, have no work ethic whatsoever, but they're rich because they're inheriting money, basically. So what do you, like Paris Hilton, Donald Trump, hello, hello, hello. I mean, how did they, you really wrote that headline? I must let everybody know. Americans are skeptical that hard work will pay off. Yeah, everybody should be. Everybody should be. Okay, now, let me give you further evidence to this effect, even though we shouldn't even have to. But this is a chart here that shows the growth in productivity versus wages. So this one specifically is productivity versus hourly compensation here. But what you see is around the 70s, it tracked perfectly well together until about the 70s, and then there was a total divergence. And what happened, for example, throughout the 80s that exacerbated this problem? You had Reagan, and then, of course, you had the Democrats who were the neoliberal Democrats who aren't really progressive. So up until a certain point, you had pretty strong unions, and unions meant that if you were more productive, you would see the fruits of those labors because you had somebody fighting for you. So you would see the fruits of your labor and do better if you worked harder, and stronger unions means more people in the middle class. But then over time, of course, there was just an all-out assault waged on unionization in this country, and you've had deregulation, you've had money in politics is probably the biggest one. I mean, you have this influx of money starting in the late 70s, and multiple Supreme Court cases since then have basically solidified the idea that money equals speech. So now you have a system of legalized bribery, and now the corporations own the government, so the government makes policy in favor of the corporations and against the average worker. And you see it here. You see that now you can be super productive, but your wages are stagnant. Your wages are flatlined because government policy is not made in your benefit. So you're getting taken advantage of. Now, some of this has to do with, I should be clear, with the increase in technology. So some of the worker productivity, oh, well, the technology got better and yeah, the internet and all this stuff. So the line should diverge a little bit, some people will say. Not to this extent, man. I mean, we've had stagnant wages now since the 80s. And it's clear that it's not the case that the harder you work, the further you go. Okay, let me give you another fact. 76% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. This is from Bankrate. Bankrate did this report. This is CNN Money reporting on it here, but 76% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So what is it? Let me ask you guys. Do you really believe that, well, it's just obvious that 76% of the American people are just like really lazy? That's what it is. 76% of the Americans, they don't work hard, but they live paycheck to paycheck. No, the overwhelming majority of those people really work hard, and they're still living paycheck to paycheck. How about this fact? Over 50% of Americans make $30,000 a year or less. Now, again, this is an argument where people would have you believe, the establishment would have you believe, well, it's just lazy, half the country's really lazy. I mean, they deserve to live in poverty because they're like so lazy. What does that even mean, man? I mean, think about it. When you broaden the scope out to the world here, you have, 8 people now, I think, have more wealth than the bottom 50% of the world. So that's 8 people with more wealth, or about the same amount of wealth as 3.6 billion people, or 3.8 billion, roughly that amount. Isn't that crazy? Imagine that as like a pizza pie. Like how many slices go to 8 people and how many slices are left? Half the pie goes to 8 people, and then the other half the pie goes to over 3.5 billion people. That's just a system. It's not like those 8 people just worked harder. It's that the system is broken and the system is rigged. That's what it is. And then the final fact I'll bring up here is that the American dream is no longer the American dream. The American dream is now the Canadian dream. The American dream is now the Canadian dream. So the category known as social mobility, which is, or economic mobility, which is the ability for somebody born onto one rung of the economic ladder to move up to a different rung, that happens more often in Canada than it does in the U.S. So the old idea about the U.S. was, well, you come here, you work hard, you'll make it. You know, your parents might be poor, but guess what? You're going to break into that middle class. And then you have a kid, and the kid's born middle class, and maybe that kid will break into the top earners of society. Well, it turns out that happens more often in Canada than the U.S. The American dream is now the Canadian dream. So yeah, are Americans right to say, hey, we're pretty skeptical that hard work will pay off? Yeah, they are. You know, some people can work hard and they get the right breaks and the right opportunities, like they say in this, and then they end up doing well for themselves. Other people work hard their entire life, they get no breaks, no opportunity, and they're screwed. So keep that in mind. This is not a meritocracy. It's a sick lie that we live in a meritocracy. And by the way, this is why a social democracy is the answer and why it's so important. Because people need to have the basics met. And it's not too much to ask in what's supposed to be the richest society that ever existed to say, guess what? You are actually going to have equal opportunity. You're going to have healthcare. You're going to have education. You're going to have vacation time. You're going to have daycare. You're going to have infrastructure, the best infrastructure in the world. When you give people the bare minimum and you give them a chance, they'll work hard and many of them will thrive. The idea is to set up a system where we can have more of a meritocracy. Because right now, it's certainly not a meritocracy, and the data proves it.